Hello and welcome to GED Live Heredity, to another GED Science screencast. Today's topic, Important Concepts in Science You Need to Know, Part 3. If you find these videos helpful, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. This helps us a lot to reach more people like you who want to prepare and pass their GED science tests. All right, today's concepts we will talk about are heredity or inheritance and evolution by natural selection. So heredity or inheritance is the transmission of genetic information from generation to generation. This genetic information, which is passed on from generation to generation, is located on our chromosomes, our DNA molecules, in our cells, and stored in the genetic code. A gene itself is a specific length of DNA which contains the information for a protein, and these proteins in return are the cause of many of our physical traits like our eye color or hair color or being able to roll your tongue. So how is eye color affected by proteins? The brown eye color that many of us have comes from a pigment. This pigment is a protein. The pigment is just a substance that absorbs some wavelength and reflects other wavelengths of light. Same with our skin color, for example. Our tan, this is about the melanin pigment in our skin, which is a protein. So it's all about proteins, most of our traits. And these proteins are encoded in genes in our DNA, and tiny differences in these genes lead to different variants of these genes. Now, how are these genes passed on? DNA in general is passed on from parents to offspring by either asexual or sexual reproduction. In asexual reproduction, the offspring are genetically identical to parents because it's one parent, one offspring. So the offspring will inherit the identical DNA from its one parent, whereas in sexual reproduction we have two parents, so the offspring receive a genetic blend, two equal parts of the genes or DNA from both parents. Since this half of one parent that an offspring receives is very variable, sexual reproduction leads to a lot of variation in a population, which then later on allows for evolution and natural selection to occur, which we will talk about later. Now, some more very important terms in heredity. So heredity is a lot about vocabulary that you should know about, or at least have heard of. You don't need to memorize all these terms, but it's good to have heard of them. So if they come up in the GED science test, they will probably be defined in the test. But again, if you know something in advance, if you have an idea what a text is about, it's going to be a lot easier to understand all the information in the text and test than compared to reading about it the very first time in your life. So let's start with alleles. Alleles are different variations of one gene or trait. These different alleles usually originate from mutations, genetic changes in our genes. So one gene may have several different alleles. For example, the different varieties of the gene for eye color. Now let's keep it simple. There might be two alleles for eye color. For sure there are a lot more, but if we keep it simple, there are brown eyes and blue eyes. So both of these are coming from one and the same gene, the gene for eye color, but they are slightly different versions of that same gene. So we say we have the allele for blue eyes and the allele for brown eyes. Traits are often represented by letters. For one gene we choose one letter, and for the different alleles, if it's simple inheritance, we often have just two alleles, one dominant and one recessive allele. We choose a capital and a lowercase letter. So what are dominant and recessive alleles? This is where it comes to what we will see in the end in the organism. A dominant allele is an allele that dominates over a recessive allele. When a dominant allele is present, it will always be expressed and will be visible in the organism. If both are present, a dominant and a recessive allele, the dominant allele will cover the effect of the recessive allele. It will mask the effect of the recessive allele, and only the dominant effect will be visible in the organism. So this is why the dominant allele is always represented by the uppercase letter. Recessive alleles are the ones that are going to be masked, or the effect is covered or hidden by the dominant allele when the dominant allele is present, and the recessive allele is only visible when two recessive alleles are present in the organism and no dominant allele is present. Okay, I should mention something here, that organisms usually have two alleles of each gene, or two copies of each gene. The reason for that is that we have two parents. We have a mother and a father. We got one set of DNA from our father, one set of DNA from our mother, and these sets of DNA contain all the same genes. So you get all the genes once from your mother, you get all the genes once from your father. So we have two copies of each gene. Now these genes may be of different alleles. So from your father you might get a recessive allele for blue eyes, and from your mother you might get a dominant allele for brown eyes. You have two copies of the eye color gene, one dominant, one recessive. You will end up with brown eyes, not with brown blue eyes, just with brown eyes. As we said, the dominant allele will cover up, will mask the effect of the recessive allele. Two other important terms, homozygous and heterozygous, refers to the combination of alleles. An organism that is homozygous has twice the same allele for a gene. So it's a big B, or a small b, two big letters, two small letters. Since we have two possible versions for homozygous, we often have to specify here. So we call it either homozygous dominant, referring to two dominant alleles being present of that one gene, or homozygous recessive, referring to two recessive alleles being present. And obviously then we have the version where we have a dominant and a recessive allele. We call this heterozygous or a hybrid. Quick recap, the terms homo and hetero, or the prefixes homo and hetero, we find them very often in science. Homo means same, hetero means different. So homozygous, twice the same alleles, heterozygous, different alleles. Two more terms, phenotype and genotype. Phenotype are the physical appearance, is the physical appearance of an organism, which comes from the expressed alleles, and as well the effects of the environment on the organism. Whereas the genotype refers to the combination of all the alleles that are present in the organism, or the genotype referred to a specific gene, the allele combination of that specific gene. So different genotypes, the different possible genotypes are homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, or heterozygous. These are three possible genotypes in simple inheritance. The probability of inheriting traits, another skill that is really important for the GED science test, being able to work with and construct Punnett squares. A Punnett square is a chart used to calculate the probability of parents passing on a trait to their children and the probability of the different possible outcomes. One parent's allele on a Punnett square go to the top, and the other parent's alleles go to the left side. So for example, here on top we have the father's alleles, and on the left side we have the mother's alleles. The parents' alleles are matched up inside each box to show all allele combinations, all genotypes, all possible genotypes that the child could receive. So here, if it's eye color, we have a big B and a small b, so the father has brown eyes and is heterozygous. The mother is small b, has blue eyes and is homozygous. We complete the Punnett square. The big B goes down the column, so a big B here, then the small b goes down that column, big small b here, and these two small b's go down the rows, and we can see that all the different possible combinations. Now the father could pass on his big B for brown eyes, the dominant allele, to his child, or he could eventually pass on the blue eye allele, the recessive allele, to his child. The chance for this happening is a 50-50 chance. And then we see the different possible outcomes. Each box or each field in the Punnett square represents a probability of 25%. We have 4 boxes, 100% that have to add up to 100%. So we can see each box equals 25%. Recall that brown eyes are dominant over blue eyes. The Punnett square shows the eye color probabilities for the child of a brown-eyed father. We said that already, big B, small b, and a blue-eyed mother, small b, small b. The child has a 50% chance of having brown eyes and a 50% chance of having blue eyes. You can see that here these two represent blue eyes, whereas these two heterozygous genotypes will lead to brown eyes. So 2 more examples. Here we have the color of peas, yellow being dominant and green being recessive. We can have a look what possible combinations do we get here. We get these, so again we have 50% and 50%. In this case we have a homozygous dominant person with brown eyes and a homozygous recessive person with brown eyes. What are the possible outcomes here? 100% offspring with brown eyes, but all of the offspring will be heterozygous, carrying an allele for blue eyes, which they then in the next generation may pass on to their offspring. This is the reason why some traits, especially recessive traits, often skip a generation. Now we can see that here, let's say these are grandparents. One grandparent had brown eyes, the other blue eyes, and all of the children will have brown eyes. This is one of your parent will have brown eyes, but carry the allele for blue eyes. If your other parent has blue eyes, that means that you and your siblings have a 50% chance of having blue eyes again. All right. Let's move on to evolution. Evolution is the change in the characteristics of a species over several generations and relies on the process of natural selection. So again, evolution, the theory of evolution is about continuous change in the characteristics of a species over several generations, which in return may lead to the formation of new species. For evolution to occur, some important conditions must be met. First of all species are related and gradually change over time. We know the tree of life, that the tree of life in the end converges to a single point, which is the common ancestor of all living things that are alive today. So all living things are related to each other. There is genetic variation in population which affects the physical characteristics, the phenotypes of an organism. Which means, if we look at us humans, we're all a little bit different from each other, although we belong to the same species. Now, this is because of genetic variation. There's genetic variation in our human population. And some of these characteristics may give an individual an advantage over other individuals, which they can then pass on to their offspring, an evolutionary advantage. So how exactly do these changes work, and does evolution have a certain underlying principle how it works? And this principle is natural selection. It's really important to understand a few very important steps about how natural selection works. I've tried to break it down here into a few simple points that are helpful for you to understand. So first of all, individuals in a species, as we already said, they show variation in their physical characteristics. Sometimes new variations may pop up again, which are mutations in genes leading to new alleles. And this variation is because of differences in genes. Now, individuals with characteristics that are best suited to their environment are more likely to survive. Again, because we have variation, individuals are different, which means some individuals may have a higher chance of survival or higher chance of finding food, making use of food, avoiding predators, being better camouflaged, for example, or being able to resist disease better than other organisms. The organisms that are And these individuals are then more likely to reproduce and pass on these beneficial traits to their children. So it's not only about having traits that allow an organism to be well adapted to their environment and give them an advantage to survive, but as well these characteristics have to lead to a more reproductive success, and they have to be able to be passed on to the next generation as well, so that the trait makes it to the next generation. On the opposite side, individuals that are poorly adapted to their environment are less likely to survive and reproduce. Therefore, their genes are less likely to be passed on to the next generation. And as a consequence, those individuals which are most or best suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce, and given enough time, the species will gradually change over time, and we will find more and more the trait that allows better survival and higher rate of reproduction. These traits that increase the survivability and the reproductive success are called adaptations. Maybe you may have heard about fitness and survival of the fittest related to evolution. These terms are very often misunderstood, especially survival of the fittest. It doesn't have to do anything with the strongest organism or the fastest organisms or so on. It just relates to who in the population at that point in time is best adapted to the environment that this population is living in, and which organism has the greatest reproductive success. And these organisms, they might change over time as well, the ones that are best adapted to their environment, because the environment itself is object to continuous change. So something that's very important to understand is that evolution is a very flexible and changing process. It's nothing that is static. Change is happening all the time in a species, in a population, but as well in the environment. So an organism that is well adapted at one point of its life might actually, because of a change in the environment, a drastic change in the environment, may actually be at some point or a couple of generations later, a certain trait that was an adaptation may no longer be an adaptation, and maybe another trait that was before not very successful now becomes a new adaptation in the population. So because the environment is continuously changing, adaptations are subject to change as well. An organism well adapted to its environment may find itself in a changed environment struggling, and other organisms will have a higher chance of survival and reproduction instead. Okay, I hope this short breakdown of these two topics has helped you. I hope I can help you with these short presentations to improve your understanding of science and give you help you improve, and it makes you able to earn your GED Science credentials at the end. If you find these videos helpful, again, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. Again, the more subscribe, the more people we can reach, and this is really what we want to achieve with our videos here. We want to help as many people as possible that either can't afford private education or that live in remote places and can't travel to learning centers. All right, I hope to see you for part 4 in important concepts you need to know for the GED Science.